In 2023, climate tech companies raised collectively 51 billion of private equity and venture capital money. But one region of the world is still dramatically underfunded: Africa. But what if the problem isn't a lack of talent or a lack of startups, but rather a lack of imagination in how we invest? To unpack this complex topic, I'm joined by Desirée Petterson, head of impact at Satgana, and a sharp thinker on how venture capital must evolve to meet the realities of emerging markets. You are watching or listening to VCO2, the podcast that makes you a better climate tech entrepreneur and a smarter impact investor. And before we start, please don't forget to leave us a like, a comment, and a subscribe on YouTube, or give us a follow and a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and Spotify. This really helps us, so thank you so much for those that will do it. And let's dive in. This episode is sponsored by Dealmaker. Dealmaker helps cleantech companies bypass traditional funding barriers and raise millions on their own terms by going directly to investors online. For example, EnergyX raised over 75 million from 40,000 investors using Dealmaker's solution. So if you're ready to fuel your vision, visit dealmaker.tech to learn more. Thank you to Dealmaker for sponsoring this episode. So, Desiree, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it. And I guess to get started, I'd love to hear about your story in terms of how did you get in Satgana as a VC, but also why did you decide to actually live in Kenya?
So for me, doing something with climate has always been the red thread in my academic and professional decisions. I can really trace it back even to when I was 14 and I saw Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in 6th grade, and it really hit home for me. So since then, I was trying to figure out where do I fit into the climate puzzle, basically, and where do I want to go. And then in my undergrad, I started to do a lot of economic history classes, focused a lot on Africa, and I started becoming quite uncomfortable with the feeling of like counting on poverty lines in Excel, and it felt very far away, and you were trying to understand actually the concept of economic development and poverty. So I decided to do my bachelor thesis in South Africa with a nonprofit there that was giving free food in a township to people that basically had nothing. And during those 3 months, when I really saw poverty in the eye and experienced everything that comes with it, from drugs, from crime, from unemployment, everything is so interconnected. And actually, when I went down there, I thought I wanted to go more into the aid and development path. But my main takeaway from that experience and talking to people was entrepreneurship, or basically creating jobs, is the best way to spur socioeconomic development. And the ones that are best positioned to do that is local entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of money coming in different ways, but most of it doesn't really trickle down to the ones that need it the most. So I was there and trying to make sense of it and realized, okay, so empowering entrepreneurs in Africa, that's at the intersection of climate. So I started looking for funds that were investing both in Europe and Africa. So I had the incredible luck of meeting Roma, who's the GP of Satgana, roughly 3 years ago, when he was still in the early days of building Satgana. I was still at uni and had no VC experience, but we got along really well. Very similar values, very much doing it from the heart, let's say, and not from a climate buzz or hype. So we stayed in touch. I did an internship at a VC in Europe, in Amsterdam, focusing on energy startups. Really liked the world of VC, but I wasn't in VC for VC, if that makes sense. I was really there because I wanted to move money where I think it's most needed, which for me has always been climate, and then came Africa. So when I was there, I really always had Satgana and Roma at the back of my mind, and reached back out when that internship was done and asked, okay, how are you going? Because it was a first time fund. So I joined them as a working student. Um, and then sitting from Sweden and looking at pitch decks coming in from Africa, I felt, yeah, I mean, I cannot do this. This doesn't feel right. I really need to go there, see the market, speak to people, just open this box that I'm very interested in. So I went to Kenya for 6 months in 2024. Fell in love with the country, the people, the nature, everything about it. And I also wrote my master thesis on basically the opportunities and shortcomings of the venture capital model there, which gave me a lot of great insight into what we're doing today. Came back to Europe, but then actually really wanted to go back again because 6 months is not enough for investing there. So I was there for 4 months again now this year, and just came back.
Amazing. And I guess, part of the climate issue that we have is that there is this problem where like the people that are actually creating a lot of emissions are not those that suffer the most from it. And actually it's the opposite. The poor countries that in fact emit less CO2 actually suffer the most from it. What's your perspective after having lived in Kenya for a few months? Like, have you seen the effect already of climate change there?
Yes, for sure. So that's something that's, I think, super powerful. But when you move to a country like Kenya, for example, you realize how stuck you are in the carbon tunnel, the mitigation tunnel, the 2050 net zero targets. But when you go there, you realize that these people are so vulnerable to extreme shocks, and they are not in the future. They are there. So last year, during the rainy season, which was in April, I have never experienced rain like that. It was insane. Like the sky is open and it just doesn't stop. And you're going with these boda boda drivers and you have water up until your knees and everything is flooded. And then you see that people are living in these slum areas that have no protection against this rain. They have they have nothing to protect themselves against it. And that's really when you realize the impact of climate change is not going to be like one day it all just popped and we reached a percentage in the atmosphere that we cannot take anymore. It's this gradual decline of people's livelihood and also pushing them into a state where they can no longer protect themselves. And I think living in Kenya, even though I haven't done that for so long, but for these 2 periods and also in South Africa, you realize that people who've done the least to cause it, that are doing nothing, are feeling it the most, and they're already doing it.
Hopefully, startups and venture capital is going to help solve some of that. So I think the topic of today is, how to invest in Africa, which I think is not done by all investors. A lot of investors stay in Europe or in America, but not a lot of people invest in Africa. I guess maybe to get started on that, what's your perspective on the landscape of startups and venture capital in Africa today? Is it as developed as other continents in the world, or like what's the status there?
No, so it's very much a new and emerging ecosystem. I think kind of you really say that you start tracking deal counts around 2014 is when you're seeing like more and more activity coming or VC activity happening around the continent. So it's really just 10 years, which is basically one fund cycle. So it's really, really nascent and emerging, which means that, of course, there are growth pains, both on the entrepreneur side and on the investor side, trying to figure out how do you build VC scalable businesses in an emerging market context with all the nuances that come with it. But it also means that you have so much opportunity to develop it, to grow it, you're no longer like looking at an established playbook of this is how it needs to be done. You really have the opportunity to come in there with a child's eye and look at it, because most people are still looking at it from a way that we don't have it figured out, but most still needs to be built.
And do you have any idea of like in terms of if we were to estimate a number in terms of like what the size of a given market in Africa compared to other countries? Is there something along those lines that you can share?
Yeah, so in terms of both equity, debt, and grants, 2.2 billion euro flowed in terms of VC funding to the African ecosystem last year. And I think from 2018 up until 2024, it's around 19-20 billion. So to put that in perspective, just for 2024, it's still around 1% of global VC activity. So it's super, super small and still behind LATAM and Asia as well. So it's up, like it's coming, but if you put it in perspective, it's still very small.
I guess, what are the type of companies that you've seen there so far? Because obviously, as you said, climate change is happening already there. It probably influences the type of companies that you see emerging as well. So do you have examples of that?
Yeah. So starting kind of from a Satgana point of view, we've structured the thesis to be focused more on the environmental objective of the company. So because we're still Eurocentric, because we have one fund and we're investing 70% of that capital in Europe, 30% in Africa. So how we structure the thesis is to have climate change mitigation as the primary objective. So that's tons of GHG reduced, removed, avoided. And then we also look at circular economy because that's very interrelated, but also adaptation, which is really an important need in Africa. So I think when you look at climate tech startups in Africa, you also realize that they like basically investing in a company that's also creating jobs is in a way increasing the resilience of that community because there's more people employed, there's more income. So I think the way to look at that is that basically any investment that can be part of creating more jobs in Africa is also strengthening their resilience to absorb external shocks. But ideally, what we want to do is invest in startups in different sectors of the economy that have a low carbon impact and also puts them on a trajectory where they're not locking themselves into a high emissions curve, but actually able to grow in a way, green growth, as we can often call it, that allows them to grow, create jobs, become more wealthy, but that also doesn't have a negative impact on the environment. So basically not building in the legacy infrastructure we're seeing in Europe and the US that has a very high fossil footprint, but doing it with businesses that actually can leverage the insane amount of renewable energy potential they have in form of solar, geothermal, hydro. Also, they have so many competitive advantages in Africa when it comes to climate. So not only the renewable energy potential, but also the biggest available land of across the world that you can still use. You have the geologic formation, for example, in Kenya that allows you to store CO2 there. You have the continent with the most population growth in the coming decades that are hungry, that are want to work. So if you can give them the right jobs to help them grow the economy in this way, that's wonderful.
But I'm curious, and maybe that's why I push you a bit in a corner. But like, if we think about the first steps in terms of like development, don't you think they just want to get wealthier and have a more comfortable lifestyle, as we've done as Europeans and Americans before, and Asians as well, rather than actually solving for climate, which is not even a problem they've created themselves, right?
Yeah, of course. So I think that's a really great point. Like when you go to someone in Africa or in Kenya, where I have most experience, you cannot expect them to care or pay a green premium or build a company only on the basis that hey, we're more environmentally friendly than X, but X is a lot cheaper. Like that will never work. The way to build businesses is really like how can we utilize these competitive advantages that I just mentioned to build a business that is greener, but that's just a nice add-on, but actually cheaper, and that is ideally as much as possible also catering to the basic needs that many in the population need. So we as investors can brand it as climate because we can look at it from that angle, that it has that positive knock-on effect. But from an entrepreneur point of view or from a customer point of view, they're not building it for that reason. They're building it for socioeconomic development.
And what is an example of that? Because when you mention these factors, I'm like, if technically, for example, you build a SaaS business and all of the electricity is coming from renewables, in your definition of it, could be a climate company, or at least like you could look at it from a climate angle. What's some of example that you have in mind?
You mean of a specific portfolio company? Okay, I think one example that can just speak to this, where you can really marry affordability and climate, is we have one portfolio company called Revivo. So they have a marketplace for secondhand phones and laptops. Straightforward example, but in the sense that like many Kenyans cannot afford a new phone or a new laptop, so they're even more incentivized to buy things at a lower cost. And if you can be part of extending product lifetime, make sure that it's a more circular model. That becomes these clear examples of, yes, we can have a positive impact, which also makes economically sense. And so it's really also, I think, when you are in an emerging market context where you don't think you can always buy new anymore, then you also get creative. Like, how can we make the most out of the things that we already have produced, and instead of just throwing it away when its first lifetime is over.
And do you see some of the more traditional type of companies like carbon removal companies, for example?
Yeah, for sure. We have one in our portfolio called Sirona Technologies, which is, I think it's a great example that speaks to this topic, because they are really utilizing the competitive advantages that Kenya has to offer to put it's a direct air capture company, to become more globally competitive than other facilities across the world. And the reason for that really highlights what Africa can offer, that can put them at the forefront of the green transition, because they're able to use cheap renewable energy, both in the form of solar, but also geothermal. The grid in Kenya is 93% renewable, so it's green and it's low cost. And they can also store the CO2 that they capture underground, because often where there is geothermal energy, you also have a good ability to store it. So I think this is an example of a company that is not even from the region, but that is looking at Africa like, wow, it has so much potential to give us what we need to build a competitive global product in terms of climate. And I think when you look at it from that perspective, from the natural endowment perspective, from the population growth perspective, if you can navigate the nuances of an emerging market, it has so much to offer there.
But I guess you also want to see probably companies from the region itself, right? Because otherwise the problem is like, what if you come and just like come with your set of people that will work on your plant or factory, for example, and all of a sudden you don't create local employment anymore.
Yeah, no, that's a great point as well. So I think we, of course, want to see local founders be building these businesses as well, and that's definitely something that we do. And in this case, it is very much the founder profile of the CEO of Sirona, who has a lot of experience scaling hardware from Tesla, that we saw was very determined to bring speed and scale of scaling hardware to the DAC industry, which is basically the main bottleneck there. Like, we know the technology, but it needs to scale. So we really believed in him as a person. And then in terms of him wanting to be in Kenya, we also really pushed for like, okay, how can you make this also local business here? How do you work with the community? How do you hire local talent that can help you put this technology to good use here, and not just you coming thinking that just because you have the machine doesn't mean you have everything figured out. And I think when you see that cross-border collaboration across Europe and Africa, which is also at the heart of Satgana, that's when we become really excited, because nobody can figure it out by themselves. And the more you kind of marry thoughts, experiences, yeah.
For sure. I love that. You mentioned earlier that we can't really go in Africa and replicate the playbook that we've been playing in the venture capital world in Europe and in America for the last decades. What's the playbook in Africa? How can you, if you were to give advice to an investor that wants to start to invest there, what are the 5 steps that you should follow?
Ooh, I wish it was that easy, but I would. I think my first advice, and I'm not sure I'm in a position to give advice, but come with that child's eye approach. I think also because I'm young and I don't at all claim to have everything figured out in terms of venture capital or Africa, but I think my master thesis research, that was very open-ended and exploratory, helped me understand that you cannot just take an investment instrument and kind of force fit it into a market. Like, you take the instrument and you think, okay, I want to take elements of it, like being risk tolerant, wanting to support entrepreneurs, equity, all of those key elements, but think, how can I adapt it here to be more fit for the local market? So I think speaking to entrepreneurs, speaking to investors who have been there longer, trying to understand what does it take to build a company here. So kind of if you do a theory of change, starting like what problem do I want to solve for? Okay, when this is clear, then how am I gonna do that? What is the best tool or investment strategy to do that from? Rather than the other way around, thinking like I have my fixed instrument and I'm gonna drill it no matter what it looks like. And that's something I'm really excited about, like to the point earlier that you have that it's still so moldable. It's still in the early days where new thoughts and things can easily float.
And are there some specific features of venture capital that will change in Africa according to you? For example, is it going to be longer holding period of the equity because it might take longer to build the companies, or is it a different playbook in terms of how VCs are incentivized to invest in Africa? Like what according to you will change?
Yeah, the one who lives will see. But I think what I think will happen is more equity and VC investors also starting to work more closely with local debt providers, because they see that equity is not a silver bullet to all the needs a founder has there, because most of the businesses in Africa are more have a hardware component or have boots on the ground. They need to spend more time building the supporting infrastructure around the core product and service, which one impacts how long it takes to build and scale a company, but two, also the type of capital that they need. And when you go to Africa, the capital stack is a lot less sophisticated. So it's less easy for a founder to grab some cash from family and friends and then some grants and then some. So I think the role of investors there is also to help them figure out how can we help them blend their capital stack according to their needs, not only give them equity and wait and see that they are then raising equity while they instead would be needing working capital, which means that they dilute too much, they have too much growth pressure, and instead thinking, okay, who can we partner with or work with to complement the financing needs of this company? I really think that's an important role for the investors in Africa to play, because in Europe, it's less of that need because the capital stack is more sophisticated. And then, secondly, I also think more collaboration between funds and investors, because the ecosystem is so new and still figuring it out and maturing. I also think, okay, building that secondaries market. So who buys out the early stage investors? How can we make sure that the capital keeps flowing so that there's not a bottleneck at some point? How do we work more with corporates early on to identify those exit opportunities with our founders, rather than putting money in, waiting 7 years and being like, oh, I want out? Really thinking creatively about, okay, how do I support my founder in identifying who this is interesting for?
Do you think investors are able to innovate?
I think so. I think not all. I think I think it depends on why the investors are in the game and investing, and if they're doing it because they truly want to have impact, whether that is in climate or whether that is just building successful businesses. I think if that's your motivation for being in that chair, then they will innovate. If they see that the old playbook is not perfect, then I think definitely that with great collaboration and great ideas, people will want to move.
And you said earlier that we need more collaboration when investing in Africa. Is it less competitive to invest in Africa today than it is in Europe, for example?
Mm, I would say that more and more capital is flowing in, and that it is becoming. I still think that it is more collaborative to some extent than Europe, because you're trying to help each other find good deals and exchanging ideas, because no one claims to have it fully figured out. But to a certain extent, because then if that one deal that is very maybe hyped or fits the VC playbook really well, then it is it's like a chicken and an egg problem sometimes with the deal flow and the investors. So I think collaboration up until a certain point, but then also everyone trying to build their name and their brand and their track record. So yeah, I find that a bit difficult to answer.
For sure. And is there a fund or like I don't know another model of like investing in startup in Africa that inspires you? Is there someone that you really look up to and be like, okay, they're actually doing well in the continent?
Yeah, there is one fund called Grounded Investment Company. The two founders have a lot of experience building ventures on the African continent. They're originally from Netherlands, and they have really innovated a model which is being able to invest both equity and debt into specifically food processing companies in the agri value chain, so high crop commodities. And I think they are an example of a fund that is really taking the bottom up approach to investing. So looking at the ground, how do we invest in a way that creates local jobs that can optimize existing supply chains, but we're not doing it only from the VC model, but we're actually innovating both the strategy, the tools, the structure to be more fit. And yeah, I find it very admirable.
And can you elaborate on what it means to invest from bottom up as opposed to top down?
So for me, and this is just my own mental model, but that comes back to the theory of change that I tried to mention before. That it's instead of thinking like, okay, I'm going to raise a VC fund to solve climate change in Africa, you're thinking, okay, I really want to do something about climate change in Africa. What verticals am I interested in? What part of it do I want to tackle? Then you do your research, you speak to people, and then you think, okay, then what is the best way to invest in the company solving this problem? How do I go about it from also almost like an entrepreneur point of view? Like, how do I solve that pain point with the capital that I want to raise? And also thinking, is that going to be commercial, concessional, a blend? For me, that is how I visualize a real top or bottom up approach where you're tackling from that exploratory angle rather than picking your tool first.
Yeah, I guess in Europe today it's a bit different because, as you said, like the playbook is established, so you can just say, "I want to raise an impact fund," which it's still difficult to do. Don't get me wrong, but I want to raise an impact fund. I want to invest in energy, and that's your playbook, and you go with it. You don't really have to look at, okay, is there actually companies in this sector that we can invest in? Because I guess part of the challenge in Africa as well is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like uh, part of the challenge that you might not find companies in every vertical that we typically have in other part of the world when it comes to climate. And maybe that leads me to my next question, which is about like, how have you decided on which sector and verticals that you wanted to invest with Satgana in Africa?
So that's again coming back to the thesis of the fund being structured more according to the environmental objective of the startup. And I think that's actually something that has benefited us really well because when we say climate change mitigation, then we look across sectors of the economy. So that can be energy, that can be transportation, agriculture, carbon removal, and that in a way keeps it very broad and open-ended, which but still within the same environmental KPI, if that makes sense. So having that as the North Star, but that one allows you to have more deal flow because there are just more companies under that umbrella. And two also allows us as a young fund to understand, okay, what opportunities are out there, which ones do we feel like we are most excited about, or do we want to stay broad? Yeah.
And do you have enough deal flow? Do you feel like?
Yeah, for sure. So now we're, as mentioned, 70% Europe, 30% Africa, and we've been able to keep that split quite well. And I definitely see a lot of high quality deal flow coming out. Important kind of to mention is that 80% roughly of the VC funding in Africa goes to the big four markets. So that's Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Egypt. So you say Africa, but in a sense, you're speaking about four countries that have established the present quite well. And for us, we have most expertise on north, east, and south.
Well, I guess to transition to another section, I really want to talk about the opportunity and the risk in investing in Africa. Um, I know you have a contrarian opinion on that, but you think that not investing in Africa is a risk. Can you explain that?
Yes. So the way I see it is that we live in a hyper globalized world where what happens in Africa doesn't stay in Africa. So by not investing there, that means that you're putting that whole region on a trajectory that is still going to impact the global economy and society, because not investing there now, not being proactive but rather reactive when the impacts are becoming even worse, will mean broken supply chains and a broken food system, basically, if we cannot source from that region, which has a lot of the produce that we want. Same goes for all the critical and rare earth metals and minerals that we need for the energy transition. And I think it's just a horrible figure, but by 2050, 1 in 2 climate refugees will come from Africa. So that says something about the magnitude of the problem, that not investing there now, you're pushing forward an enormous bill in terms of many different aspects, both on the refugee side, also on the food and supply chain side. So I think not investing there is thinking that it's too risky. Yes, it is an emerging market and it has additional risks to it, but pushing it forward, we're taking a huge risk upon ourselves, because we depend on the well-being of all regions in the world, and having one forgotten continent, which is going to be the fastest growing in terms of population as well, I think is a huge risk.
But then on the other side, it's also a great opportunity to invest there because, as you said, it's going to be the fastest growing in terms of population. From an economical point of view, I could only assume that it's going to follow a similar trajectory to the growing population. So obviously investing there is also investing in a market which by default, by design, is growing, as opposed to doing it in other regions of the world, which, I don't think the GDP of Europe last year grew by so much, maybe a couple of percent. But look, I guess we are coming towards the end of this podcast. We have one last section. It's called the fire questions. You'll have 1 sentence maximum to answer any of these questions. Are you ready for that?
All right, let's do it.
What's the most underestimated climate tech sector in Africa?
Um, Actually, okay, one sentence. I think logistics, it might sound boring, but ensuring and high efficiency across especially agriculture supply chains, many people don't see it as a climate solution, but having waste at every part of that value chain is a huge climate problem, because every resource you're putting into something that never reaches the market is a big failure in my mind.
So reducing waste, basically.
Yeah, supply chain efficiency.
Makes sense. Is there a European myth that needs to die, according to you, in terms of VC?
That you cannot build VC scalable businesses in Africa.
Love that. What's one change that would make VC truly a fit for emerging market?
Not one change, a series of incremental changes. But maybe helping founders blend their capital stack better.
I love that. Is there a funder or a company in Africa that more people should know about?
One of our portfolio companies called Build Cubic. They're turning difficult to recycle plastic waste into low carbon building materials, solving many problems in one.
Love that. What's the best innovation you've seen in the climate space?
Maybe building on the above example, but everything that is turning waste into value. Because I think you're reducing virgin material use, you're reducing GHG emissions, you're reducing the amount of waste in landfills. So I'm becoming more and more a fan of circular business models.
For sure. I think someone said waste is only waste if you waste it. And I think it's a good way of putting it together. If you were not a VC, and I know that you're not a VC because you love VC, but more because you see it as a solution, what role would you play in the environmental transition?
I would either be in a climate tech startup myself, or found one, or I would be investing either from a philanthropic side, or from a even more impact investing point of view.
Interesting. If we take a step back and talk about climate tech in general, not only about Africa, what's one thing that traditional VC misunderstand about climate tech in general?
think maybe also related to my perception of risk in Africa. Like, it's not about climate because it's nice or because it's good. We need to future-proof the planet that we live on. We only have one planet, and sometimes I think that this short-term profit maximization is blinding everyone because we're not realizing we're chopping off the tree that we're sitting on, basically, or the branch of the tree, and by not investing in climate, you're basically pushing forward a huge bill and huge societal risks to future generations. So yeah, even if you're purely commercially driven, I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's one thing that I'm trying also to push with this podcast. That's also why I want to talk to investors about climate. It's because I want to make sure everyone understands that climate is an economic opportunity, and also comes back to the risk that we have with climate. As you said, we are at risk. The planet is not really at risk. Like, the planet is going to live long after we die, but we as a species could be completely gone in a few years if we don't act fast enough. So I agree with you. Even from a commercial point of view, it just makes sense to do it. When you invest in a startup, what's a green flag?
A green flag is someone who is deeply in love with the problem, who has maybe even quit another well-paying job or had another option, but they really am obsessed with solving this part of climate change, and they're gonna go heads down to do it.
What's a red flag?
Red flag is someone who woke up and saw, okay, climate is a new buzzword, it's a new hype. I'm gonna try to just build something in this vertical because it's cool now, but would drop it a few years later. And I think me being very, very climate and impact at heart, I think I have a good compass of sensing that.
For sure. If someone is listening to you and they want to become an impact VC later in their career, what are the three most important things to be successful?
Be very curious about new technologies, about meeting people. I would also say be very humble to that this ecosystem is changing. Nobody has all the answers, and always, approach it with that child's eye, which I think I hope I can keep my whole life. I think that would benefit me a lot. And three, I would say be hungry, because it is really competitive out there, and it's also a lot of stuff happening. So you need to have a lot of energy and be hungry to work.
For sure. If someone wants to dive deeper in terms of like investing in Africa, for example, or investing in climate in general, is there a podcast, a book, a movie, maybe your thesis?
I really like a podcast called The Flip, which is focusing on investing in Africa, and then Zero by Akshat Ratti, who is a climate journalist from Bloomberg. He has a great podcast that I listen to every week.
Great. Well, you should listen to VCO2 a bit more.
Also, from
kidding.
now on.
If people want to reach out after this podcast, where can they find you online?
On LinkedIn, I would say is easiest, or Desirée at Satgana.com.
Great. And one last question for you today. Who's the next person that should be in your seat for an interview?
I would say Aloin Blondin. He is the investment manager of an African venture capital firm called Lofty Inc. I had the pleasure of becoming friends with him through a random event, and we're still in really good contact. And his insights about this ecosystem, his humbleness is striking, and I've learned so much from him.
Great. Well, looking forward to speaking with him then.
Yeah.
And listeners, if you like this episode and if you like the show, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you're on YouTube, or give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you so much for today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. I really loved it.